بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. This is lesson 1C. The goal of this lesson is to understand the type of water which is permissible for use for purificatory purposes. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, states in his first line, purification is valid with the following types of water: rainwater, well water, spring water, river water, sea water, even if salty, and water from melted snow or hail. So the first thing he tells us is that anything that is normally considered to be water unconditionally, this is permitted to use for the purposes of purification. Now, when we talk about what he's about to mention is a discussion on the conditioning of water. So before we get to that, what he's trying to make us understand is that anything that a reasonable person would consider to be water without conditioning, by needing to say it's rose water, for instance, that specifying the type of water it is, then this is permitted to use for purificatory purposes. So conceptually we can break this down and say that water which is permitted for the purposes of purification must be pure, namely that it is not filthy, and this is fairly straightforward. If filth has fallen into the water, then it wouldn't be permitted to use that water, because the basis is that if you're trying to get into a state of ritual purity and purification, you must take the means of using water which is intrinsically pure in and of itself, right? Otherwise, how are you going to get into a state of purity if the thing you are using in order to get into that state is in and of itself filthy? So we'll be talking more about this in a later lesson. Today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the purifying nature of water, which is that it is not conditioned by anything. So the author continues, such water may be used for purification as long as it remains purifying, namely to remain with its natural characteristics. So the first thing is that it must remain within its natural characteristics for it to be acceptable to use for the purposes of purification. And the second thing, with nothing having mixed with it, such as to condition it, and thereby remove its purifying quality. So whenever you condition the water such that it is no longer what we would normally consider to be water, what we could say al-ma' al-mutlaq, which is unconditioned water, this is the point at which it would be not permissible to use such water or such fluid for the purposes of purification. So to illustrate this further, if we take the example of a tea bag and we place the tea bag now into a cup of normal water, we would find that the water changes color and becomes tea colored. So now if you asked any reasonable person who just saw this happen, they would probably say that this is tea water, right? Now, depending on which country you're in and the climate, if the water is very warm, it may in fact become tea. But assuming moderate, average temperatures, then we can comfortably say that this is tea water and it's no longer just water. So how did we come to this conclusion? Well, if you look at this glass of water, would you say that it is a glass of water, or would you say it's a glass of something else? Right. So this is the upshot. And if you were to watch this, then you would probably say that this is tea water. And the fact that you cannot say water to this, i.e. water alone, to the fluid which is in this glass, indicates that it's now been conditioned. Similarly, if we take an example of liquid, and we have some orange juice, for instance, and we poured some of this orange juice into the glass of water, we would find again that it changes color. Now, it's very possible that if you only put a small amount of orange juice into the water, then somebody could say that it's simply orange water. And orange water is fine, because orange here is not really a conditioning of the water, rather it's a description of the water which is in front of you, right? So you're affirming that what is in front of you is in fact water, but you're merely describing it and saying that it just so happens to be orange. Now, there's a number of conditions and a number of things which need to take place in order for such water to be permissible for purificatory purposes, but just in order to get the idea across. Somebody reasonable could say it's orange water. If you were to put slightly more orange juice into this cup, most people will probably say that it's now some kind of drink. It's now some kind of orangey liquid mush, depending on the nature of the juice which was used, and it's no longer water, right? So were you to see this cup, you would say this is some kind of drink, right, or some kind of juice of sorts. So we took an example of a solid and we took an example of a liquid. So now, if we look at conditioning agents, they can either be solid or liquid, and if the conditioning agent is a solid, like our example of the tea bag, then what we're looking for is the normality of the water, that has the water retained its subtle and flowing nature. So in and of itself, water is considered to be subtle, and it's considered to have a flowing, intrinsic flowing nature, that it flows, for instance, over limbs, right? So as long as this is still present, then it's acceptable to use such water for the purposes of purification. So a practical example would be that if somebody was out camping or they were hiking, and they came across a large body of water, and there's some trees which surround this body of water, and the leaves have fallen off the trees and into the large body of water, and because of this, the water itself is now completely filled with leaves, at least the top surface of the water, and the water is now a green murky color, and it also smells very leafy, and it's so it looks leafy, it smells leafy, and if you were to taste it, it tastes like trees. So in this case, it would still be acceptable for you to use the water for the purposes of purification if it still retains its normal, subtle and flowing nature as water, right? That would you still say, if you pulled a cup out, would you still say this is water, right? So if you got a cup, an empty cup, and you took some water from the lake and you took it out, would you say this body of water, would you say that this is a cup of water, or would you say this is a cup of green fluid? So if you could affirm that this is a cup of water, but it just so happens to be green because of the leaves, then this is acceptable, because saying leafy water or green water is merely a description of the water, and it's not a conditioning of the water to say that this isn't actually water, rather it is something else. And this is why the second condition here is that you can still call whatever this particular fluid is, you can still call it water. So as long as it retains its normal nature, and you can still call it water, then it's acceptable. So we saw this in the example of the tea, right? That if it still retains its normal nature, that if you just dipped the tea bag into the glass of water and then you took it out, could you? It's very conceivable that a reasonable person would say that this is maybe light tea water, or merely brownish water. Right? So the fact that he's merely describing the water and not saying it's tea means that it's acceptable now to use it for the purposes of purification. When it comes to liquids, then what we're looking for is a different consideration, and that is whether the color, the taste, or the smell of the thing which was admixed with the water has now overcome or overwhelmed the natural color, taste, and smell of the water itself. Right. So if you say water is colorless, then it kind of excludes that. But if you say, well, I put some orange juice into the water, well, orange juice has color, and orange juice has taste, and orange juice, depending on how fresh it is, it's possible that it has smell. So they say if most of these attributes of this thing, which is orange juice in this case, the thing which is admixed with the water, manifest within the water itself, then it's not permissible to use the remaining, this fluid which you have of, in our example of orange juice and water, for the purposes of purification, because the fact that most of the attributes of the thing which was admixed with the water have overcome the natural or the nature of the water itself, this is an indication that it's no longer unconditioned water. Right, that it's no longer water which is permissible for the purposes of purification. So the author continues, he says, this ruling applies whether the water is flowing or in a large cistern, namely one with a surface area of at least 10 by 10 cubits, with a depth such that its floor is not exposed by scooping water out with both hands. So if we were to look at what he means by a large cistern is a large body of water which has a surface area of at least 5 meters by 5 meters. So a cubit is from your fingertips until your elbow. So it's approximately 50 centimeters, and approximately 10 cubits would be 5 meters by 5 meters. And this is what is considered to be a large pool, something that will come up again in a later lesson. And he says this type of pool and flowing water, they have the same ruling. The same ruling also applies to a small body of water, right? One which has a surface area of less than 10 cubits by 10 cubits, as long as the conditions which he mentions are also met, which is that it's not conditioned by anything, so it's still pure and it's still purifying. So as long as these conditions are also met, the same would apply to a small body of water. He says that its floor is not exposed, so with a depth such that its floor is not exposed by scooping water out with both hands. This merely affirms that we are in fact talking about a pool of water and not merely talking about a puddle or something that's not really in reality a body of water. And this is what he means by the depth. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.